Hey folks, in today's video I want to start setting up the data structures that are going to represent our blog posts. Here is the code and the components that I currently have for a blog post. And as you can see, most of them are just different components that represent the data in our blog post. For example, the heading, the post information is the category type, the publish date, and the author. I have a component for showing images. This is just a generic paragraph component. And here we have a code block with highlighting on it. And what I want to do now is I want to take this information and I want to create a data structure for this so that we can edit and render our blog posts in a way that makes sense. I'm going to get into the actual data structures here in a little bit, but I also want to talk about the process that I go through when I work on things like this. I don't know if this will be helpful for a lot of people out there, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. But this is just a general process that I go through. The first thing that I do when I'm designing structures or an application like this, I look at other applications out there that are already doing this thing. It's not very often that you're doing something for the first time, so why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? And since the whole goal of this series is to replace my blog that's being hosted by WordPress, the first place I went to was WordPress to see how they save their data. This is the edit page in my current blog of how you create blog posts. And I do want to preface this by saying that I've never done any development for WordPress plugins or the editor or anything like that. So what I'm seeing is just what I assume it's saving based off of what it's showing me. And also from a few things that I found online by looking at their database structure and what's saved in those database tables. My goal in this project is obviously not to rewrite WordPress, but I do want to have some type of editing interface where I can create blog posts that are simple and make sense and are easy to program, because I don't want this to be an application that's going to take me months and months to create. But the way that WordPress does this and the way that other applications do this, for example, Notion or Jira or Confluence if you've used those, is that most things are just blocks of some type of content. So for example, here, this is just a paragraph block, and you can change the block type by clicking on here, and I can change it to whatever other options that they have. Same thing with headers. You can change if it's an H1 and H2 and H3, etc., etc. And in WordPress, if you come over here and you change this to the code editor, you can see the actual code that's being saved. And from what I can tell, this is also what gets saved to the database. And the way that WordPress does it is in each block you have the raw HTML, but you also have this comment that describes what it is. And for most of them, like this paragraph, it's just the raw HTML. But headings, you can see that it has a property for what level it is. Similar thing down here for images, it has the size and the destination. And then if I scroll down a little bit more, this is a section that's for a code block, and you can see it has the language as a property. The one thing I like about this is that it's simple. When you want to render this code, all you have to do is strip out the comments, and for the most part, it's going to work. What I don't like about this is when you want to edit this, you have to parse these comments to get the information out of it so that you're showing the correct things in the editor. I'm not going to do it this way, but I'm going to show you how I designed my objects to represent the classes that are the post and the blocks that are inside of it. And I'll show you a couple pros and cons of how I've decided I'm going to do it. And the general idea of how I want to do this is there are different properties that are specific to a blog post, and then there's different properties that are specific to the different type of content blocks that are inside of it. So for example, a blog post is going to have a title and an author. And then for example, a heading is going to have the content that is inside of it, and then some type of indicator of whether or not it's an H1 or an H2, H3, etc. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go create those entities. In my Blazor blog project, I'm going to go ahead and add a new directory. I'm going to call it data. This is just the way that I like to structure my projects. I usually put the entities that represent my data objects and anything related to the database inside of this data folder. And then I'll create another directory called entities, and this is to hold the actual C# entities that represent my data. And then I'll create a class, and this will be for the blog post. Now I'll just start throwing out properties that make sense for a blog post. Here are the properties I'm going to start with. The ID, so that we can save it in the database. The title of what the page is going to be. The date that it was created, the date that it was published. This status will be for whether or not it's public facing or not, so basically whether or not you've published it or if you're still working on it. And then a URL for what the cover image is going to be. I also need to create a class that's going to represent the author. And then inside of it, I'm going to have a list of blocks. And I'm calling them blocks, but these are basically the different sections, which can be paragraphs, code blocks, images, and things like that. I also need to add one more I just thought of, which is going to be the URL slug. And that will be the actual URL for the given blog post. And next I'll start creating these blocks. For now, I'm just going to put all these classes in the same file, and then I'll move them later. And the way that I think about things like this is all of these different blocks are going to have some things in common, but then other blocks are going to have things specific to them. And I'm going to do this using inheritance. And so my block is just going to be the ID, which post it belongs to, and then what type of a block it is. Then I'll create other classes that inherit from block for things like images, code blocks, headers, and things like that. And those classes will have attributes specific to that block type. The first block I'm going to create is going to be a heading block. And of course I want that to inherit from block. I think the main two things we need for this is what level it is. So if it's an H1, H2, H3, etc., and what the content of it is. So public string level, and then a public string content. And next I'll do a paragraph block. And I'm calling it a paragraph block, but this is basically just a generic block for text. And I think the only thing it needs is content. And I'll fill out a couple more here and I'll show you the result. I've gone ahead and I've also added paragraph block, code block, and image block. And then I also added an author, and for now I'm just going to give the author a name. And then I uncommented these two lines up here that were in the blog post. And this is a decent start for the structure of my blog post and its blocks. But I do want to point out a couple things before I move on to implementing some of this stuff, which is there's another way that you could do this, which is one thing that I actually thought about. And that's by not using inheritance, but just parsing JSON for the data of the different blocks. The one downside to how I'm doing this is I'm very tightly coupling the structure of my database to each individual type of block that's going to be in my blog posts. For my blog, I'm not going to be using that many. This probably isn't that big of a deal, but I do want to show you an alternative that you could use. What you could do is instead of having the different classes inherit from block, you could have something like this where you have a string that you might call something like data. And that would be a JSON string that would represent the data or the properties of whatever type of block that is. For example, for my heading block, I have level and content. So if this were, for example, a heading, then this data field would be something like this. It would look something like this. So it would be a JSON string representing what this block would actually look like if it was serialized into JSON. So the level is 1, the content is how to make a blog. And the advantage to this is that you don't have to have all of these different columns that represent the different information in your database. You could just have a single block table that is all of this information, and you can put anything you want inside of data. Now the downside to this is that when you read this information from the database, you're going to have to parse this into whatever the type of that block is. So for now, I'm not going to do it this way, but in the future, if I find out that the way I'm doing it is going to cause problems, I may end up doing this anyways. I do want to show this. I'll put a link in the description down below. But when I was Googling and trying to find other ideas for data structures, I found this information about how Notion does it. And Notion actually does it pretty much like I was just showing, with a few major differences. So if you scroll down here, this is a block and it has an ID and a type. And then they call it properties, which is what I was calling data. But those are the different properties that are specific to that type of a block. So for example, this is a checklist, so their title is write a blog post about blocks, and then they have whether or not it's checked. And then the way they do it is they have content that represent other IDs of what's inside of that to-do list. And then they have a reference back to its parent. I don't want to make it this complicated. I don't need it to be this fancy, but this is a pretty interesting read if you want to go take a look at it. Also, one other property I'm going to need in the block is going to be the order, so that I know what order the blocks are in as they're being rendered and edited. And now that I have a basic data structure set up, I want to go see if I can make it work to render a page. And this is a way that I work often, is I actually work backwards. So I know that the goal of this is to create an editor so that I can create a blog post. But that means I have to create the editor, I have to save it to the database, and I have to query it and then render it. So the first thing I'll do is I'll create a test page, and I'll create the objects and assign data manually in the code, and then just make sure that it can render correctly. And to do that, I'm going to have to start restructuring all my components, because right now I'm just passing in render fragments of the actual HTML. So I'll start going through that, and I'll just briefly talk about what I'm doing. The first thing I want to do is I want to create a component that is going to represent the viewer for a given blog post. The way that I have it set up right now is I have this SQL on MacBook component that represents a post in my blog. But I want to have a page that I can just give either an ID or a slug of the URL that's going to go retrieve this information from the database and then render that given blog post. So I will add a new component. It'll be a page, and I'll just call it post viewer. And I want to have this take in a parameter, which is going to be, for now, I'll just call it slug. And then in my code, I want to have that be a parameter, public string. And now I want to simulate retrieving something from the database. So I'm not going to set up all the database stuff now to go get it. So I'm just going to create the entities manually, and then that will represent what might come back from the database. So I'll create a public blog post. I'll just call it post for now. And that will just be a local variable on my page. And then I'll create my uninitialized method, and I will start creating the objects inside of that. So post equals a new blog post. Here's just a little bit of basic information from my blog post. So I added author. Now I want to start adding blocks to it. And I'm just going to start with a couple really simple ones and make sure that they work. So I'll say post.blocks.add. And for the first one, I'll just do a paragraph block because they're super simple. Paragraph block. I've added 2 paragraph blocks. There's one thing in here that I don't like right now, which is the magic text for what the block type is. So just really quick, I'm going to go create a constants class for this. Here's a really simple class. I just called it block types. It's a static class, and I have some const strings in there for paragraph, code, heading, and images, which is the 4 different block types that I have currently. And now back on my post viewer, I can update these magic strings. And now those block types can be those constants. Now what I want to do is I want to actually render this as HTML. And if I go back and look at the blog post that I created as just a little template, I have the divs that represent the main content and the right-hand side of the page. And then I have the heading and the post information, image, URLs, etc., etc. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this, put it into my post viewer. And I want to keep the div that shows the connect with us and the recent related on the right-hand side. And then the stuff in the middle, I'm going to take out almost all of it except for one of the paragraphs and the first heading. Now this is where a bunch of refactoring comes in. My current components for heading and paragraph take render fragments. So I'm just creating the heading and I'm passing in the HTML that I want it to render for me. But now we want to pass it the different classes that represent that block type. So a heading should take in a heading block and a paragraph should take in a paragraph block. So we got to do a bunch of refactoring. I'm going to start with the heading. And basically what we need to do is we need to remove all the stuff we're not going to use and just pass in a single parameter, which is the heading block. So I'll take out the heading type. This parameter will be a heading block, and I'll call it heading block. This render fragment can go away. And now our switch is not going to be on the type anymore. It's going to be on the level. So this will be heading block.level. And right now I actually have this as another magic string, and I want to make this another constant. For now, these are constants. I may end up moving these into the database later. But I'll go into constants and I'll create another class to represent those levels. For now, I'll just do level 1, 2, and 3. And my first case statement will just be constants.levels.level1. And we're no longer taking a child content render fragment. This instead is going to be the heading block.content. And then I'll update the same thing for 2 and 3. Now that I've updated the heading component, it needs to take in a heading block. And with a post, I just have this title here. So I could change how I do it a little bit, or one thing I could do is just add a new block for the heading and specify it's an H1, which I think I'll do for now. I may change this later. So I'll say post.blocks, add, and I'll say new heading block. The content is just going to be the post title. The block type will be constants.blocktypes heading. Order will be 0. And then the level will just be level 1. Now what I can do is I can just loop through all of the blocks that are in my post and then render them out. So I'll do a for each block in my post.blocks. And then in here, I can just do a switch statement on the block type and then use my components to render that specific block type. Doesn't matter what order I do these in, so I'll just start with the header. And then this will be my heading component. And it's just going to take in a heading block, which will be block. And you can see it's actually mad because it's not the right type, because it's expecting a heading block, not a block, which is the parent type. So you can just cast it as a heading block. And then I'll do the same thing for the paragraph. I do need to go into my paragraph block and do a similar thing where I update what it's going to take in as a parameter. Really quickly, I'll go do that. The parameter no longer is a render fragment. It will be a paragraph block. And then of course, instead of child content, it'll just be the content of the block. Okay, so now if I go back into here, this should be happy. It's taking in a paragraph block. And I'm gonna go ahead and remove these other 2 that I have in there. And now we should be able to run this. Oh, I should probably update my endpoint. I'm gonna update the URL here just so it's I'll just call it /test for now. And then any slug name will go to this page. Let's go see if this works. I went to test/hi. And as you can see, it's printing out the title of how to make a blog. And then 2 little paragraph blocks that are rendering the blocks that we coded in there. So that means it's working. I'll go in now and I'll add in my other blocks, which is the code block and the image block. And I'll put in a little bit of test data and we'll make sure that that works as well. I've done a few different things here. First, I just added the case statements for the code block and the image block. And then I added a demo image block and a code block down here at the bottom. And you can see it is showing the image as well as the code block, and it has the syntax highlighting. My last video, I talked about how to do that. I do need to point out that in my new post viewer component, I did have to add the JavaScript file here that calls the highlight all. And then I had to add this page script. I went over all of this in my previous video, so go check that out if you need this. And now this shows that my data structure is going to work and I can render my component so that it can be displayed on my website. The next step after this, of course, is going to be setting up the database and making sure that that all is going to work. And then after that will be how to set up an editor so that we can edit this stuff instead of doing it all through the code like we are now. Those, of course, are going to be future videos. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. If you have any questions, put them in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.